Hello, how are you? Well, the weather today is rainy and horrible, and it's not nice out there. It's wet and yeah, it's just not nice. But it's good for some things. It's good for watering the garden. It's good for the ducks. And weather is weather. So we've had a difficult week. Andrea hasn't been well, and I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you to all the people that have been praying, and if you've got anybody with a mental illness or whatever, support them and get them to doctors, and don't poo-poo them, because unless you have experienced some kind of mental illness, you don't know what they're going through. So yeah, just support them and be there for them. Hello to the people who are coming online. It's nice to see you. And today we've reached the last book in the series of 12 minor prophets, and we're gonna split this into two parts, just basically because there was a little bit too much information to get into one part, so the two parts may be slightly shorter, but on the other hand, they may not be. I don't know. I don't actually time these things beforehand, so there we are. But yeah, Malachi. We'll get going. We need to talk about something that arises from all of the Old Testament prophets first. Most of the Old Testament prophets, if not all, are the predictions are of a future of the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, and yet they aren't overly talked about within churches these days. Why not? There are three different ways of treating these predictions about Israel. Things about future predictions about Jerusalem and Israel will actually come true. Whether they come true, it falls into three categories. The first is that the church believes that all these promises were conditional. They were conditional on Israel being faithful and obedient to God. This is the first of the three ways. And because the Jews had broken the conditions, these prophecies about Jerusalem and Israel won't happen ever. They've been cancelled out. They will never happen because the conditions attached to them were not fulfilled. These things can happen if you cooperate, and having not cooperated, Israel forfeited the prophecies, and in particular they refused Jesus as the Messiah, and the Jews have now forfeited their entire future. All these predictions have fallen to ground, and they will never happen. That's the first way of looking at this. The second way is that they were unconditional, and it's not a case of what happened, of they will happen if but they will happen whether or not. It doesn't matter. These things are going to happen. Then God has said that God has said, this is what I intend to do, and he will do it. But within these people, this second set of people who say that this is going to happen, there are two different ways in which people think this will happen. The first is he replaced Israel in a symbolic or a spiritual way, quite often with the church. And quite often the church is referred to as the new Israel, that they are being fulfilled. This is called replacement theology. And the church has now replaced Israel. Therefore, all the predictions made to Israel are not to be are now to be fulfilled in the church, and being fulfilled in the present, but in a spiritual way, not in a literal way. So that we are being brought to a heavenly Jerusalem and not an earthly Jerusalem. And the promises of fertility and blessings are seen in the church growth these days. All the predictions of blessings are applied to the church in this particular genre of thinking. And all the predictions of cursing are done away with and not talked about. But here we are taking bits of the Bible and discarding bits of the Bible. We're taking the bits that we like and we're discarding the bits that we don't like. And blessings are coming on the church, and the curses are left to Israel. Well, you can't do that. You either have to take the whole lot or nothing at all. And that's my issue with this. This, however, would be the majority view in churches these days, that God is finished with Israel. And yet the name Israel occurs in the New Testament 74 times. And not once is it applied to the church. In 73 of those, it is clearly applied to the Jewish people. The third way of looking at this is that these prophecies were unconditional, that they will happen and apply to Israel as God said they would. And we are still waiting for quite a few to happen. This is the view that I've taken during the whole of the 12 minor prophets. You are welcome to dig into this and look at it with your own mind and make your own mind up. And that's in essence the point of what I've been doing. I've tried to put a number of different standpoints. I obviously have my own understanding and my own theories on things, but I've tried to, and you've got to look at things in a particular way, but I've tried where it's relevant to give you all the information as such that's out there. And the phrase "all Israel will be saved" tends to focus on Christ's second coming rather than his first. But Paul in Romans 11 says, has God finished with the Jews? Never. They may have rejected him, but he hasn't rejected them. The fact that Malachi says, I hate divorce, is God saying, I hate divorce. And God doesn't give up easily. The story of Hosea marrying the prostitute if that doesn't say it all from God's perspective, I don't know what does. He said to them again and again, to the people, you may break your covenant with me, but I will never break it with you. The fact that they are still around says a lot. God keeps his word. They are still his chosen people, even in unbelief. When he comes back, why? What's the need of him coming back? The background, what's the need in him coming back? Basically to take us to heaven? No, because when we die, we will already be there. So there's no need to take us to heaven. And quite a few people have asked me about heaven and Abraham's bosom and Sheol and the abyss and all that sort of stuff. So I may do a session one day specifically on that, because quite a lot of people get that all twisted about, and that again will be my understanding of it. Why does he have to bring us all back to live on earth with him? We aren't going to live. We are all going to live on earth for a second time. That's where he's going to give us new bodies. You don't need a new body to live in heaven, but you do need a new body to live here. There's some great purpose to be fulfilled here, long before there's ever a new heaven and a new earth. Why has he come back? He's going to reign over all of the nations, and for us to shout hallelujah. So the kingdoms of the world have become the kingdom of our God and our Christ. So that having been said, let's move on to Malachi. The background is much the same to Haggai and Zechariah, only it's a lot worse. We've gone forwards 100 years now, and after the return from Babylon, and things are not good. They've got worse. Jerusalem is still deserted. People are living in the country and still don't want to come back into the city. The land is still largely barren and uncultivated, and they are getting locust storms. Life is hard and precarious. The temple was finished in 520 BC, but it's much smaller than Solomon's temple, and the walls that they built around the city are still up, but people are still preferring to live in the countryside, and it's a job getting them back into town. The family of Zerubbabel are living in a poor house, and Zerubbabel Zerubbabel isn't the king anymore. Joshua has been made king, and Joshua isn't allowed to reign. The Persian governor is still the ruler, and they are nothing like the kingdom of David. The people are disappointed, they're disillusioned, and they're despairing. And they are beginning to ask, was it all worth it? They've been back 100 years, and they've done absolutely nothing in their eyes. Whereas, where's the kingdom we were going to build, is what they're saying. Why bother? They're becoming complacent and content with settling for what they've got. They were down, and this depression was having a devastating effect on their religious life. They learned the lessons of idolatry in exile, so they never went back to other gods, but their religion had become a formality. They never went to idolatry, but they had become complacent. They still went to the temple, but it was largely out of tradition, and it was a ritual without reality. It was no longer a priority to them. They were asking what was the minimum that they could do. What was the minimum amount of time that they could spend on religious activity? What was the minimum amount of money they could give away to it? How small a coin could they put in the temple collection and it still be acceptable? It's like giving a tip rather than giving a gift. The fact is, the more you put into your faith, the more you get out of it. And the less you put into it, the less you get out of it. I know that the more I read the Bible, the more I study the Bible, the more I get out of the Bible, and the more I realise about the Bible. And at this point, I would highly recommend the Daily Audio Bible, which is an app on your phone, which is a guy called Brian reading a bit of the Old Testament, a bit of the New Testament, a bit of Proverbs, and a bit of Psalms every day. And I've advocated this for years, and it sets you up great for the day. It gives you about 20 minutes to half an hour of Bible teaching and Bible reading, and it's a really, really good thing, the Daily Audio Bible. But anyway, the fact is that the people of Israel in Malachi's day were their faith was basically non-existent. The priests were much the same as the people, and by the time that Malachi came along, the priests were doing it for a living. They were not bothered about how many people came along to the service. As long as they got through it and got their living, that's all they were bothered about. And some pastors and vicars are like this. Some people have come to neglect their flock, and these priests were neglecting teaching the scriptures. They were just keeping the services going in a casual or careless manner, and if anything would basically anything would do for God. No longer did they offer the best, they were just keeping it going. When you get this attitude to your religious life, it begins to affect your moral life too. And this affected their outside lives. When you say, why bother about God? It's not long till you say, why bother trying to be godly? And if you don't pass God on through the generations, then you don't pass goodness on. When one generation gets this way about God, the next generation will be saying, why be good? And we can see this on our streets today. Generations have lost God a couple of generations ago, and our streets are becoming more and more violent, more and more crime, and more dispassionate about people. You can live on the goodness of your forefathers, but goodness runs out, and when God runs out, and then God runs out, and God's running out of society. This is what Malachi had found himself in the middle of. And the people were saying, just look at yourself, just look after yourself. Look after yourself, make as much money as you can, and give as little to God as possible. Sound familiar? It's quite a regular occurrence in these days. Consumerism took over. They even opened a supermarket outside of the city walls so they could open it on a Sabbath day, because inside the city walls nothing was supposed to open on a Sabbath. You're not supposed to do any work, but outside the city walls it didn't matter. This had a devastating effect on family life. Why be faithful to God soon became why be faithful to your wife, especially when your wife is getting older and losing her looks and losing her sex appeal. And why not trade her in for a later model? Which is exactly what they were doing. They were also short of women, because most of the people that came back were men, so they were short of women. So they started marrying outside of God's people. And the rationale was that Solomon did it, so it's okay. Totally disregarding the law. The city of Jerusalem was being filled with abandoned wives. There was no welfare state, and they had a pretty rough time. Widows and orphans and abandoned wives filled the city of Jerusalem. They didn't blame the government, or they didn't have a government to blame, so they blamed God. They blamed God for everything. They said, God's not bothered about us, so we won't be bothered about God. God has stopped loving us, so we'll stop loving God. We can't believe in a God of love when we're in this situation. Sound familiar? There's loads and loads and loads about Malachi that sounds as if it could have been written yesterday. We're having to look after ourselves. He's abandoned us, so we'll look after number one. God doesn't reward good living, and he doesn't punish bad people, so why bother? Now, this seems so real and so relevant. Almost, as I said, sounds like today. And they ask, is the Bible relevant? All you've got to do is read Malachi. All you've got to do is read any of the books of the Bible. Because I did a talk for Asylum, the Goth church in London, a couple of weeks ago. And it was all about, is the Bible relevant? And I think you can find elements in every part of the Old Testament and the New to make the Bible relevant to today. And it's just a matter of looking. And in Malachi, this is all relevant. The way that the people were getting, they didn't care about God, and their morals and immoral standing and violence in the city and the divorce rate and everything was going up. Well, that just sounds like today. So what's wrong with bending God's laws? Malachi came into this scenario. Malachi wrote his message in prose, not in poetry, which indicates that God has lost his feelings. God generally writes in poetry when he's writing about his love and things, but he writes in prose when he's lost his feelings for his people. And that's exactly what had happened. And after Malachi, he wasn't going to talk to them for about another 400 years. And the book of Malachi was his last word to them for 400 years. It's a very cool word. It's not a heart word, it's a head word. Malachi was unusual as a prophet in that he had arguments with people. He obviously spoke this word because Malachi was heckled by people, and they were often offended by his words, because his basic message was, you started all this. It was not God who stopped being bothered about you, but you who stopped being bothered about God first. Much the same as Haggai had said. In Paul, again in Romans 1, said, men gave God up, so God gave men up. We live in the second most godless nation in the world at the moment, in the UK. According to Reader's Digest, Japan came out first, and people just aren't bothered about God. When people aren't bothered about him, he's not bothered about us. And look at the result. Violence takes over, selfishness and pride take over. And this is what was happening in Malachi's time. This is the circumstance and the environment that Malachi was coming into. So Malachi had to be a really strong character and a really interesting person. I would love to have had the opportunity to sit down and talk to Malachi, because he sounds like a heck of a guy, and to be able to stand up there and argue his point when he was basically arguing against the majority of people, he must have had some balls. He said, you were the first to stop caring, stop loving, and stop bothering. And he has stopped bothering with you. And your lack of basic love for him is the problem. And they didn't believe him. They were offended. They repeatedly protested their innocence. It's not as bad as you make it out. They felt insulted and offended. They were indignant, and they argued. How did we give up on God? Spell it out. It's much the same as the parable of the sheep and the goats in Jesus' teaching. He said, I was in prison, and you didn't visit me. I was hungry, and you didn't feed me. And the people said, how? When? We didn't see you in prison. We didn't see you hungry. Oh, yes, you did, said Christ. Because I live in my brethren. Whenever you see any of your brothers who are in prison or are hungry or are thirsty, and you don't do anything for them, you're not doing it for me. And here's much the same reply. How did we not bother with God? Paying God lip service is not paying him any service at all. Malachi takes them through it step by step. His whole prophecy with them is an argument, and it's to show them how they did it, how they stopped caring about God and therefore caused him to stop caring about them. Malachi has some unique features. Malachi has 5 distinct and very unusual features. The first is there are more God words in Malachi than in any other minor prophet. 47 out of the 55 verses are direct words from God. 85% of the words are God's word. That is a vastly high proportion. The second one, this book is anonymous. And I've been dying to say this. Malachi wasn't the guy's name. The guy is anonymous. Malachi means God's messenger or the messenger. So this is just a book from the messenger of God. But we've attributed Malachi to his name. There's nobody else in the Old Testament called Malachi. It could have been his name, but it's unlikely because it's not a name used anywhere else in the Old Testament. Within this book, he uses the word messenger or Malachi of prophets, priests and kings, and he's just an anonymous messenger. The third is it is a dialogue. It takes the form of sharp exchanges between the prophet and the people. 12 times it says, but you say, where he's being heckled. They argued 12 times. They kept interrupting his sermon, saying, that's not true. That's an exaggeration. You're making all of this up. You're making us out to be worse than we are. And he had to deal with every objection, and which he did. And he did it very effectively. The fourth is, it's prose, not poetry. We've mentioned this. God had lost his love for them. God's feeling had dried up, and he feels drained. He feels exhausted, and the people, therefore, exhausted with his people, and therefore he won't talk to them for 400 years. You need to see God's heart in this. It's not just a flippant, I'm not going to talk to them. God has been trying and trying and trying and trying. He's tried through all 12 of these minor prophets. He's tried for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And then he's just had enough. He's exhausted. Sorry about that. Wouldn't you be fed up having taken them through exile and brought them home, only to have them turn around and say they are not bothered about you? And the fifth element is, this is God's last word. And the last word in the book of Malachi is a curse. And the Jews won't end their reading of this book on a curse word. So they read the previous verse. Previous verse. They deliberately won't end God's word where he ended it. So we are dealing with God's last word to his people, Israel, for 400 years. Now Malachi is an outline. Malachi talks about past survival. He talks about Jacob, or Israel, is loved by God, and Esau, Edom, is hated by God. Malachi announced that God had loved Jacob and hated Esau. How many of the deepest divisions today go right back in history? The whole Arab-Israeli conflict goes back to Ishmael and Isaac. Excuse me. And here we have a conflict which goes right back to Jacob and Esau. But loved and hated in Bible terms don't mean what they mean today. Those words, meanings are very different. And therefore we get a very different and wrong impression. To love someone is to care for them and to seek their highest good. It's not to feel good about them. It's not a gushing type of love. And to hate someone is to not care for someone and not to seek their good. Basically to be ambivalent about them. And when Jesus said, you're not worthy to follow me if you don't hate your mother and father, he wasn't saying you've got to have bitterness and resentment towards them. He's saying you've got to care for me more than them. And that's the whole meaning of that verse. And this can be very easily misunderstood. God is not just talking about back in the past, Jacob and Esau. He's not just talking about what they did years and years previously. He's really talking about the two nations of Israel and Edom. And he's reminding them that over the previous hundreds of years, he has done nothing but good for Israel, and he has punished Edom. That's what he's really talking about. Not the distant past, but the recent past. And the recent past is this. When the Babylonians came to take the Jews away and destroy Jerusalem, the Edomites, which are the descendants of Esau, living over the Jordan on the hills the other side, were thrilled, and they joined in and they said, "Hallelujah, they're finished." And they came and they took hold of the babies, the Jewish babies, by their heels and bashed their brains out against Jerusalem's wall, which sounds horrific, and it really is horrific. So God is talking about the Edomites. He hates the Edomites for doing this. This was the Edomites taking advantage of the Babylonians' invasion. My sticky thing isn't staying still. Sorry. Taking advantage of the Babylonian invasion. It's all there in the exile. They actually wrote a song about it, which, if you remember the Boney M song, that's a version of it. And it goes, "We hang our harps in the willow trees. How can we sing the songs of Zion in a foreign land? May my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, and may my hand forget its cunning. If I ever forget thee, O Jerusalem." You know the psalm. It ends, "Happy shall he be who bashed your baby's head against the stones, Edom." You get a picture there of what happened. They're putting it in a song. They're putting it in a lament. And I don't use that word very often, but lament. It's a horrific thing to happen. And Petra, where the Edomites lived, is now an empty ruin. And God threw them out by bringing the Arabs in. Then they had to go and live in the Negev desert, where there were no crops, and they had to scratch a living as virtual Bedouins, travelling Edomites. So the name Negev became Edom, and they scratched a living as wanderers. God said, Esau, I've hated. I've done that to them for what they did to you. Remember that I've loved you and I haven't cared for them. And it was from the Edomites that King Herod came. Herod was a descendant of Esau, and he managed to persuade the Romans to sell him the kingdom of Israel, and he became the king of Israel. And being an Edomite, that was the ultimate, being a king over Israel. What Malachi was saying was, look, I have done this to Edom. I've loved you and hated them. You should be grateful to me. In other words, when you're complaining about God, just think about what he's done to other people and think about what he's done for you. You'll be grateful. It's on that basis that he then begins to deal with the accusations. That they've stopped bothering about God. And we'll leave it there for this time. I know this is a short one. And we will continue Malachi next time. And at the end of that, we will have come to the end of the 12 minor prophets. And I think we'll go on and look at the major prophets then. We'll look at Daniel, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and have a good scout through them. John, one of the guys who listens to this, was asking, because I'm coming to the end of the 12 minor prophets, am I going to continue? Well, yes, is the basic answer. I'm going to continue doing the short snippets of the first 5 books of the Bible. I've just done the first of the book of Numbers, and I'll probably do the second this week. I'll do the first 5 books in short 20-minute sections. But yes, we've got quite a bit of scope to go in looking at all of the books of the Bible. So you've got me for a couple of weeks yet. So next week we'll have the end of the book of Malachi and the end of the 12 minor prophets and the end of the Old Testament, which is quite interesting. And it's quite interesting that the Old Testament, the last book of the Old Testament, ends on a curse. And maybe we'll venture into the Apocrypha, and maybe we'll venture into the book of Enoch. Who knows? We'll see how it goes. But for now, God bless. Have a great day, and thank you for being with us. I love you. God bless. Bye.